Hey everyone! If you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's mikeyOPP.com. Thanks!
Hi, I'm Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, our guest is Serge Prengel. He's a therapist, also the editor of the Active Pause podcast, and the author of the Proactive 12 Steps. Serge, how's it going?
Very good, thank you. Very nice to talk to you about this topic.
Yeah, we're excited, and thank you again for coming on. We only ask 2 questions for sure every week on this podcast, but the first one is just, if you don't mind, can you tell us where you grew up, how old you are, and what generation, if any, you consider yourself a member of?
Okay. So I grew up in different places, much of it in France, and I came to New York City, the New York City area, where I've lived all my adult life. I'm a member of the baby boomer generation. I'm 69 years old.
Perfect. Awesome. Cool. And so how old were you when you came to New York? About 18?
20.
20. Okay. And when did you become a therapist?
I became a therapist about 30 years ago.
Cool. And so I'm curious just to kind of pick your brain about therapy before we get into the topic of death. So I'm kind of curious, as a therapist, how much does that change your philosophy, like your overall philosophy of life?
So as a therapist, I am very engaged with what it is that people think and feel about their lives, how they experience the challenges they have. It leads me to constantly be in a dialogue with myself. So if you want that sense of life examined, because seeing how people confront challenges or where they get stuck is something that leads me to re-examine where I'm at. And so, it does affect my view of life and my view of what it's like to be a human being, because it's something that's not an academic topic. It's something that I see very much applying to real life day in and day out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And while I am not a therapist, it's always been one of my preoccupations. I just love human psychology, and I love the field and the advances and even the opposite of advances, but just kind of the way it moves and meanders, which kind of to that point, since this podcast is talking about death, death is something a lot of people fear. I'm both assuming that, and I've read things that support that. I'm curious, in your career as a therapist, would you say that the fear of death is like a pretty obvious and like common one, or do you think it's actually not?
I think the death and the difficulty of dealing with death is one of the essential characteristics of the human condition. Then how we deal with it is sometimes in a conscious way, in terms of orienting how we do the decisions we make in terms of how we deal with our life, or how we deal with it by avoiding the issue, but whether it's dealt with or not, whether it's something we are explicitly scared of or not, is really something that is impossible to avoid. That's a very essential part of being a human being. Like every living creature, we face death, but unlike other living creatures, we have consciousness. So it's one of the central problems of human existence.
Wow, absolutely. And this is totally the exact intersection of this podcast and where my brain goes. So I guess actually without further ado, I would love to hear your answer to the only other question we ask everyone, which is, what do you think happens when you die? And I always make sure to be specific, not like when one dies or a person or like the universal idea of a human, but what do you think will actually happen to yourself?
Well, I will cease to exist in the form in which I'm accustomed to exist. I think that's something that we all can agree on. Then we put different spins on it. And for some people, the soul will continue to exist in some way, or. Personally, I doubt that it's the case. I think it's more likely that simply my life will end, and that's it.
And so, how does that affect you? Is that depressing? Is that uplifting? Is it neither?
I think it's mostly unfathomable. Depending on the moment, I can have different emotions about it, but essentially, I believe the human mind is really not equipped to really fathom this. And we come up, with all kinds of theories and all kinds of myths and all kinds of stories about it. And, we have done that for just about as long as we have had the capacity to function as Homo sapiens. But basically, it is something that's so much bigger than what the mind evolved to do. Our mind essentially evolved to help us function as hunter-gatherers and function dealing with everyday realities of how we're going to be fed, how we're going to avoid being somebody else's food, how to find shelter, how to plan some things that are relatively manageable to plan. But we don't have the equipment to really deal with such large questions, which is why, we find we have such difficulty really staying with it.
That's fascinating. I have about 10 questions I want to ask you, and I'm not going to remember all of them. I try to take notes, but I think the most important one to ask right now would be, so if our human minds evolved to help us hunt and gather, but now we have like mental illness as a pretty widespread issue in modern culture, is that a bioevolutionary product? Like, is the ability to be depressed, is the ability to have ennui something that like evolved in us, or is that something that was always there, do you think?
Well, what evolved in us is the nervous system that enabled us to face the threats of the conditions under which we evolved. So, we basically developed to deal with very concrete threats, very concrete opportunities. We actually changed the world in a much faster time than evolution, at the scale of evolution. So we have the same, nervous system that we had way back when. But meanwhile, we changed the world totally. The world in which we function, in civilization, is vastly different. And when I say in civilization, I don't just mean in 2022. It goes back thousands of years, as we lived in civilizations for a few thousand years, which is a lot of time for us, but in very small time, on the scale of evolution. We function, for instance, what is very different is that in a state of nature, if there is a threat, the nervous system responses of fight and flight are usually very appropriate. But under a civilized situation, it's not something that you can use very often. If you have a problem with your boss at work, it's generally not a good idea to punch them in the face or to slam the door and run away. So as a result, we have a tremendous amount of pent-up energy that is released by the evolutionary mechanism of fight or flight that simply cannot find an outlet. And so, now you may wonder how it's related to your question about depression, for instance, anxiety. It's that all that energy has no place to go and has no place to find an outlet for. And so basically it's running on empty. So just the same way as if you have your car and you don't have the gear on, but you keep pressing on the gas pedal, and so, or say you have the gas pedal on and you have the brake on, any kind of analogy in which you're not moving, but there's tremendous amount of energy that is churning. And so that she then, creates, is in large part what we experience as anxiety or depression when, for instance, we can't use the energy. And so there is that sense of the nervous system circuit, shifts to the part that says all resistance is futile, which in the state of nature happens when actually all resistance is futile. But to us happens pretty often because, we cannot use fight or flight. And so we engage into that collapsed, freeze circuit, which is a very natural circuit, which was a circuit of last resort. But that's how then we experience the world.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I think you're making a great case, and I have no arguments here, and I definitely like your approach to everything. You sound very calm and meditative and reflective of like all of these things, and so I'm kind of curious on a personal level. Are you religious? Were you ever religious? And does that ever come into your life when you deal with these kind of things?
I'm not religious, but I believe that the sense of the experience that people put under the name of God is an experience that is part of the human mind. So, to take an agnostic position, I don't take a position on whether or not there is such a thing as God, but whether God created us to have the experience of God or whether we evolved to have the experience. I think it's part of being human to have an experience of something larger. And so I believe it is quite possible to have that experience without having a set of dogma or a specific religion to apply it to.
Wow, that's really cool. So if a patient comes to you and they're depressed, and your hunch, your gut feeling, or just like the diagnosis you want to give is that the religion itself is what's causing their depression, has that ever happened? And if it does happen, is there like an ethical concern on your part? Like how much as a therapist are you supposed to quote unquote interfere with that?
So it's generally not a good idea to start arguing with a client about their beliefs, because essentially, if you do that, you put yourself in a position where you are more attached in a way to your set of beliefs than to understanding the client and helping the client find a way out of their issues, through their resources. So the general idea is to help people understand better how they function and find what it is that gives them strength and ability to overcome challenges, so that they're able to find a way to overcome them in a way that is meaningful to them. So I have no problem, for instance, if a client is deeply religious, it's not my place to say, oh, by the way, I don't believe in religion.
Okay, good. Yeah. I mean, this is great. I'm really learning a lot about like what I'm interested in as far as the intersection of theology, philosophy, religion, and of course, psychology and psychiatry. Do you have concerns for the overall culture of the year 2022? What with like a pandemic, isolation, a lot of activism that points fingers, and just all sorts of like things about mental illness and mental health. Are you concerned? Do you think this is like a great time for humanity, that we're actually finally digging into this brain and how it affects us?
I think it's a really very, very challenging time, very scary time. We can find analogies at different periods where, for instance, if you take the divisiveness, we can say, oh, well, we have been through a period of civil war, so this is not unusual. This has happened. It's not just the only time. If you take the pandemic, you can say there has been periods of other pandemics like the flu. There was throughout history there have been great epidemics of plague. There's a Black Plague in the 14th century. So we can find ways in which things have happened before. The possible end of the world as we know it through climate change is a little bit more chancy to find, some other circumstances to it. But there have been plenty of civilizations that died through basically ignoring environmental constraints. And so in each one of these cases, we can say we've been, as a species, we've been there before. However, there is a very, daunting reality that this time may be for good, that we may be figuring out, getting into a time where we don't have the answers as a species, as a whole, as humanity, that we are not able to confront, the challenges. And I don't know, it is scary.
Yeah, and then so kind of along those lines, because I did ask you about fear, and I asked you about the fear of death, and then I asked you about your opinion of what happens when you die. So given your admitted opinion of when you die, which is that the form will cease to exist, does it really matter both to you and do you think in an existential sense, does it matter if our civilization kills itself off, or even if it, just perishes by a different means? Does any of this matter, do you think?
The many people who are religious feel that the only way to experience meaning is if you believe in something transcendent, and that meaning is something that's given to you by God. And my experience is that meaning is something that we have, as a human being. It's not related to, whether or not there is a God giving meaning. So personally, I feel very affected by the idea that the world may be in a bad place. It's not about, after me, I don't care. I care, for instance, about the people I love and who will, survive me. But I care about people in general. I think that's a function of being human.
This is to me very related. It might seem like a little bit of a jump to you, but since you did grow up in France and then you moved to America when you were 20, and I think I should mention that I was an English language teacher to people from other countries for about 7 or 8 years. So I spent a lot of time talking about cross-cultural communication, and I taught a lot of French people as well as other people from different parts of Europe and the rest of the world. So I'm curious, you spent 5/7 of your life in America and 2/7 in France, so I would consider you somewhat of an expert on both cultures. Do you think, culturally speaking, that either culture has a leg up or a leg down on the other one when it comes to death? Like, do you think they view death differently?
No. I think individually, people view death differently. Some cultures, of course, view death differently. I could probably, if I spent some time, find some differences between the way French people and Americans view death. I might be able to find differences, but I think that the differences are less important than the fact that it is a daunting fact of life that we try to make sense of in one way or another, and that a large part of culture is to find a way to make sense of that. And some of the other things, the big things we try to make sense of is how we are both intelligent in a traditional sense, which means cognitive, logical, whatever, conscious, but also have characteristics of an animal nature, if you want to use that dichotomy. So these are kind of big things that essentially no culture has ever fully integrated. We come to ways to deal with it or to avoid the issue, but these are things that are really difficult to really find a simple resolution to. And so they stay as some of the big unknowns over which the culture is kind of dancing around.
Got it. Wow, that's really interesting. And thank you. I love the way you answer questions. You just have this is my opinion, but also matter-of-fact and calm approach to answering questions. So I just want to let you know I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess my next question is kind of back to the personal level, but I'm really interested in picking your brain because you have 30 years of experience with different clients. I'm curious, do you think the average person is more upset when they're given a diagnosis about themselves that they're going to die, or when they learn that someone they love, like a parent, a child, or a spouse, is going to die? Which do you think affects the average person more?
That would be such a difficult question to answer. I have seen people very affected about their own death, very affected about the death of others, but very affected about their own death, sometimes in the sense not so much for them, but about the impact it has on others. So I would avoid having a big generalization there, but put it more, again, in that context of this is way beyond what our equipment, is really able to process.
Yeah. Okay. And I appreciate your answer. I think I want to ask like a sub question to it, which is when a person is in either situation, what is your best advice? So I don't know if you want to answer the same advice for both, or if you want to treat them separately.
So I would first of all very much try to avoid any tendency that I might have toward giving advice. And you give advice when you've been there, and I haven't been in the situation of dying. And in terms of close people, no two situations are alike, and so it's really, I think, a situation that calls for a sense of having some humility about not really possibly understanding what the other person is going through and what it means to them, and putting more of our effort in trying to be present with them, in trying to give them space to basically let themselves feel what is happening and let them come up with what it means to them, as opposed to giving advice.
Awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So I'm curious, going to your personal life and your experience as a therapist, what is your greatest success story? What's something that you'd like to share with our audience as far as like a time you worked with a client and you just felt a tremendous amount of success?
So, it's really something that happens. I don't think it's one case, because it comes with the same intensity for me, whether it's something that is objectively a big change or something that is less important, in terms of its manifestations, in terms of what you would grade objectively as saying, oh, wow, this is an enormous change, or this is a small change. But what feels incredibly satisfying is every time I see a client who's able to notice how they have been essentially on a track toward repeating coping mechanisms, and that the veil starts to lift, and they're able to not just understand, but also practice doing something a little bit different, and have a sense of, I'm experiencing myself as a little bit larger than I used to, because now my repertoire is something more than I used to think I did. So that sense of, like the fog lifting, the eyes opening up, perspectives becoming bigger, that sense of changing is something that I find is really so awesome that it is the reward, I think, that makes me as a therapist keep doing what I do, because it's just wonderful when it happens.
That was a very profound answer. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to hear that. And so I think the most natural question I'd want to ask you is, what has been your greatest shift in perspective? Like, so you spoke about how witnessing it in another is so wonderful. What do you think has been your greatest one?
So for me, it's similar. It's not, there is one thing because that is a change that is so, quote, important compared to others. But every time I catch myself, in that moment of being able to notice the urge to follow in an established pattern and to give myself the chance to stop on my tracks and see another possibility and to actually do it, and I appreciate it all the more that I have also the experience of how, it's easy for me as well as any other human being, but certainly me being no exception, to keep coming back to old patterns and to coping mechanisms. And so whenever, I don't take it for granted that these things, are so easy to happen or that they continue automatically. So I'm very grateful when I see myself actually very actively in the process of not falling into the old pattern.
That's cool. That's really cool. Yeah, and I can definitely identify with that answer a lot. We're running out of time here, but I do want to ask you to describe or talk about your book, please. It's called The Proactive 12 Steps, a Mindful Program for Lasting Change. I'm curious what it's about and why you wrote it, and please let our audience know.
Yeah. So I have a tremendous respect for the 12 Steps programs, AA and other similar programs for addiction, because as a therapist, I'm very interested in growth, and I'm very interested in fostering growth, outside of therapy, not just in therapy. And what happens when people follow a path that helps them overcome what I described, the tendency to go to a coping mechanism as opposed to doing something that is more functional. So I have over the years really paid a lot of attention to what happens in the 12 steps and think of it as something that's not just good for people who suffer from addiction, but essentially for all of us who deal with unfinished business, with basically all the stuff in life that leaves us wounded and keeps us coming back, to really being less able to confront the challenges of life. And so what I have done is describe this path, follow generally the sense of the 12 steps of AA, but describe it in a way that's much, much more precise, much more mindful, much more proactive, in order to outline what it is to do that helps you deal with this kind of stuckness and overcome it and be able to do lasting change. Yeah.
That's great. That's really cool. And it's kind of funny to me because we were talking about religion and everything else, and AA is famously religious to some people and famously secretly religious to others.
That's one of the points in the book is actually I do not, I think what happens is the notion of God prevents people from seeing really how much the work that's involved is personal work. So, and I think ultimately AA, with all this language of God, if AA was only founded on the idea of God, they would say pray and don't do anything else and you'll be okay. But actually the reason there's 12 steps is because, the notion of God maybe gives people a sense that God is going to do all the work, but they have to do the work in order to get better. And so by avoiding talking about God and talking about the specifics that what you have to do, that's why I called it the proactive 12 steps, because I want to really focus people on here's what you need to do. And when you do it, then you'll see the growth. It's not about praying, or it's not about, letting it happen to you. It's not a mystical process. It's a process of mindful and proactive change.
Wow, that's really cool. And I can hear the passion in your answers. So it's awesome to hear that you've spent so much time, you've done, what I consider field work, and you've written this awesome book. So I definitely am appreciative of what you're doing for people and for humanity. And so on that note, I always give my guests the last question, which is just kind of, what do you want to say to people? This is a wide audience of different varied people. So you have the floor.
So what I want to tell people is, the two words, active pause. That, the process to me about overcoming the difficulties, as I've described in the process of the proactive 12 steps, but also of dealing with reactivity, dealing with strong fears, including the fear of death and the The older question that paralyzes us is really to train ourselves to take an active pause. That is to, stop on our track and give ourselves a chance to engage our curiosity, to see things a little bit differently, to feel the fear, to feel the pressure, to feel what would normally, push us to go into the default mode, into doing what we're accustomed to doing, but to hold it just a little bit, to give ourselves a chance to see something a little bit different. And so I want to encourage people to do that and just take a minute a day, take a minute in the morning and a minute in the evening. Just take a moment where you just pause and you give yourself a chance to see what happens when you take that moment of pause and you give yourself a chance to see what's really happening inside and how something new might be emerging.
Wow, that was awesome. That was deep and profound, which I've come to kind of expect from your answers. So thank you again, Serge Prengel, for helping us put another nail in the coffin. To our audience, please check the notes for the podcast, and you'll see a link to his stuff and his book and all that. And again, to everyone listening at home, the number one way to support our podcast is just to subscribe. So thank you to those of you who have, and thank you to those of you who will. And as always, my name is Mike Oppenheim. This is the Coffin Talk Podcast, and we will see you soon.